One question I really like to ask myself, and I ask junior leaders or people who are looking into leadership in the church, how can you better yourself to better the church now?
Yeah.
Like we look at, we'll look down the track and what can the church do for me? Well, my view is, what can I learn now that is going to help the church now?
All right.
Not 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Yeah, we need to do that as well. I believe that for sure. But there's tasks, there's skills that we can learn right now that would be able to help the church in a great way. We're going to be discussing something today that 99% of us who are involved in any type of leadership to any capacity or aspiring leaders, something that we're going to have to deal with. We're going to have to grapple with it. And it's how to lead when we're not in charge.
Yeah, and this sort of thing relates to everyone, whether you're a young person, pastor, or just, in another section of leadership. You're going to be in a situation where someone else is going to be leading you. And how do you handle that?
Yeah. I mean, because even pastors, they enter into rooms where, they're in charge or they're leading at their church, but they may not be in charge when they enter another room. And so, I personally, I'm involved in many areas at the local church and as well as the national church, the UPCA. And because of that, I'm interacting with and under many different leaders. So there are areas where I actually am able to lead, but there are other areas where I'm serving under other leadership. And so I've been church administrator at POS for like 13 years now, and there under the pastor, under our assistant pastors and the church board. As a New Life Journey teacher, I'm under the New Life Journey director. Connect Group leader, I'm under the Connect Group leader, the directors there. As a singer on the music team, I'm under the music director, which just so happens to be my wife. And so there's some dynamic there, but you have to learn to step into the roles that you're in and make sure that you're following. And then I was recently appointed as national media director, but even in that capacity, I'm still answerable to the executive board. So there's these opportunities to lead, but then there's these opportunities to follow. And so there's this balance that we constantly have to work on. And in all of these areas, I am leading, but I'm not completely in charge. And like we said at the beginning, 99% of people who are leading, they're not technically fully in charge, fully in control of what their end result is going to be. And so,
absolutely,
how do we do that? How do we manage that? How do we lead when we're not in charge? And that's really what we're going to be talking about here today. We're going to try and give some advice, some examples, and see where we go. So.
Yeah, and it's important to highlight that, just because we don't have authority doesn't mean we don't have influence.
Yeah.
Because that's definitely not the case.
Yeah, that's so key, because anyone can have influence, even though they're not actually in authority in that moment. We can't wait till we're in charge in order to have influence. A great example in our Bibles is Joseph. As he was in captivity, there were different stages, and he was not the person that was in charge of Potiphar's house. Obviously, Potiphar was, but he was leading in that role. And then when he was thrown into prison, he wasn't the one that was in charge of the prison. He was under the prison guard, but he led in that moment, and he was reaching out to people and trying to guide and direct. So there was all these opportunities for him. He's not in charge. He doesn't have a whole lot of authority. He's a slave. He's a prisoner. And yet, even in those situations, he was still leading, even though he wasn't in charge.
Yeah, that's kind of like a common thing that happened throughout his entire life. Even when he was, prime minister of Egypt. You know what I mean? Like, he wasn't fully in charge, right? There's still Pharaoh, but at the same time, he had, so much influence.
Yeah, and we're all in charge of something, whether we realize it or not. We may feel like we're not really in charge of anything. All I'm doing is greeting people at church, or all I'm doing is photography, or I'm just doing this role. But we're actually in charge of something. There's something that we can be leading. There's something that we are responsible for.
Yeah, and I love that. But, as someone who's in church, who's, under a leader, where do we start?
Well, we're responsible for ourselves, number one. And so I think the best place that we can start is start with self-leadership. If that is going to be the starting point, because then that can help us in all the other areas. If we are able to lead ourselves, then we will be able to influence and lead others. So nothing will prove your ability to lead more than your ability to manage yourself. And we're constantly working on this. I know you do. You're constantly working on self-management and trying to get better. Myself, I do as well as best I can. And so what do we need to work on? That's what we should ask ourselves. What are some areas that we can get better in? How can we do this better? And, we have to be honest with ourselves. We can't ask ourselves that question and be like, this is where I want to be. I want to be a prayer warrior. I want to be this, and then just gloss over those areas. But when we ask ourselves that question, we have to be honest. Where am I at? Is my prayer life up to scratch? Are there areas that I have weaknesses? Am I ministering to the best of my ability where I'm currently at? So many of us have callings, and we feel like God is going to use us in it may be a greater capacity or in a different capacity, but are we ministering well where we're currently at? Are we being, and that kind of brings your attention back to the parable of the talents. Are we responsible? Are we making the most of the talent we have been given? What God has already given us, are we making the most of that? And so I think that's a good place to start. What do I need to study? What do I need to read? They always say leaders are readers. Do you agree?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Leaders are podcast listeners or audiobook listeners. But yeah, it's good to read. But not everyone is a reader. So you find a way that you can gain knowledge, find a way that you can grow. If maybe it's YouTube. Right. Some people learn a lot better visually. And so, reading is important, but you can also obviously grow in your knowledge and your capacity many different ways nowadays. And I touched on it a little bit, but yeah, definitely explore some leadership podcasts. There are some great ones out there. There are some secular ones. There are Christian-based ones. There are apostolic ones. So I would definitely encourage you. One of my favorites is The Restorationist with Adam Shaw. He does a great job. He's constantly talking about maximizing yourself, increasing your capacity is his catchphrase. And so, have a look at those sorts of things and see where you're at right now and see how you can take steps to get better. Yeah,
and I really love those questions that you kind of put forth. And I always, if anyone's ever talked to me, I've always maybe repeated it, and you probably hear it again. I probably even said it on this podcast. But there's a real need in our Christian walk to allocate time for self-reflection. These sort of questions are part of that, where you can sort of ask yourself those sort of questions so that you can kind of jot that down on paper. Because a lot of times we have these thoughts in our head, and it's important for really being honest with ourselves, and answering those questions so that we can really move forward and progress, right? Yeah. Yeah. And
one question I really like to ask myself, and I ask junior leaders or people who are looking into leadership in the church, how can you better yourself to better the church now?
Yeah.
We look at, we'll look down the track and what can the church do for me? Well, my view is, what can I learn now that is going to help the church now?
All right.
Not 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Yeah, we need to do that as well. I believe that for sure. But there's tasks, there's skills that we can learn right now that would be able to help the church in a great way.
It's like a question's kind of similar to JFK's, right?
Yeah. Don't ask what your church can do for you, but ask what you can do for your church. Yeah, and as you said, we need to think about these things and do honest reflection. And I guess this is just before the new year, and that's a great opportunity, self-reflection at the end of the year. So the second thing that we can do, so we start with ourselves, start with self-leadership, and then we look into the vision of the leaders that we're currently serving under. So buy into their vision. If we buy into their vision, then we can have influence, even though we're not necessarily in charge. We can help lead towards that vision, even though we're not necessarily the one who is casting the vision. So choose to put your energy behind the vision. Choose to be committed and connected to the vision of the church, the vision of the ministry that you're involved in, even if you don't agree. And that's a really difficult one.
Even if you were to disagree, right, and your leader is pointing one way and you're pointing the other way, your new idea won't get you anywhere.
Yeah.
Right? It's sort of like you're pulling rope and you're not going in either direction.
Yeah. You're working against the vision.
Exactly.
And so
even if the vision is not optimal, right? Your disagreement could be even more of a detriment to the total vision.
That's so true. And that's where submission comes into play. That's why, the Christian idea of submission is so important, because that's the way that you can move forward, even if you're in disagreement. And as you said, it might not even be the best plan,
right,
but God has put that person in charge. That person is the leader. And so we are instructed to submit to those who are in authority. Obviously, they're not sinning or doing anything like that, but we need to put our mission below their mission, because they're the ones that are leading and we're in support of that vision. And like you just pointed out, our level of submission is tried the most when we disagree. It's very easy to submit to a leader that you always agree with. It's quite difficult to submit to a leader that you're in disagreement with.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so that's one. Another one is be invested in the church. Make sure that you have investment, that you're all in, that you're not like just looking out for something better, or you've got one foot out the door. But even if you're not the quote-unquote leader, make sure that you're invested in the vision. You're invested in the church. This is my church. This is my responsibility.
Right.
And the classic example that every pastor uses is if you're walking through the car park, or if you're walking through the church and you see some rubbish on the floor, or for the Americans out there, trash, you see some trash on the floor, you pick it up. Why? Because it's my church. Yeah, right. I may not be the cleanup crew. I might not be the person who's in charge of doing that. But because it's my church, it's my responsibility to make sure that the church looks as nice as possible.
Right.
So that's a classic example of how we can show that the progression of the church becomes part of our responsibility as well.
So, Greg, I know we touched base on disagreement, and I want to kind of talk about that a little bit more, because disagreement happens all the time. Mm-hmm. How do we address it?
Well, one thing I like to say is that you can be a critical thinker without being critical. So try your best to not be critical, but it's okay to think critically about something, right? So what does that mean? It's okay to disagree without criticizing somebody or attacking them or doing it with a bad attitude. You can disagree with someone without being critical to them. Leadership brings with it responsibility. And so our responsibility is that we can't be the ones that are tearing down other leaders. We can't be the ones that are doing those sorts of things. So yes, we can think critically about something, but let's not be critical. Think critically about the things around you. So how can we do things better? This is something that I've been doing for years at my local church when it comes to integrating guests, when it comes to how we present our Sunday services. And obviously it's not just me, it's everyone that's involved there, especially our pastor who's leading it. And we're constantly reevaluating things. How can we do these better? How can we do announcements better? And I did a whole number of podcasts about that at the beginning when I first started this podcast. But, how can we do things better? How can I serve better? How can I lead better? How can I be a better support? How can I do things better? And then think about how to approach your leader about it. So if you are seeing an area that can be done better, the vast majority of people that are leading, they're doing it bivocationally. So it's not like they're just sitting around thinking only about what they've been tasked to lead, but they have so many other things that are pulling at them. You might have someone who is a youth leader, but then they've also got kids at home. They've got a job that they're working at. And then people who are blessed to work full-time for the ministry, that's great, but they also have other things that are pulling at them. So if you see an area that you can be helpful, that you can provide feedback, think about how you're going to approach your leader about that. Great ideas can be rejected because of poor communication. If the leader feels like they're being attacked, if someone feels like you're not just trying to help them, but you're trying to, make them look bad. Yeah. And you may not be doing that. You might be doing it with the purest of motives, but because of the way you communicated it, it came across wrong. And I've definitely done that. I've been in leadership for over a decade now, and I've definitely rubbed people the wrong way, completely ill-intentioned. I didn't want to do it that way. I was just trying to help, but it's quite easy to come across the wrong way if you're not thinking through what you're saying before you say it, right? And we don't always have that opportunity, but if we do have the opportunity to think about what we're going to say before we approach a leader with a project or with something that we can help them do better, then we should definitely think that through. And this is one that really has frustrated me over the years, is people who identify an issue, but then don't identify any way that we can solve the issue. So it's like, hey, this is not good. And then they just leave it with you as the leader to try and fix it. If you're doing that to your leader, I guarantee you it is so frustrating to them because we know that things aren't perfect, right? And again, like I said at the outset, there are areas where I'm leading, there's areas where I'm support. And, we know that not everything is perfect. If we're going to provide feedback, if we are going to think critically as someone who is trying to lead but not in charge, then it is incumbent on us to provide a plan along with that idea, right? If we're going to say that something can be done better, we need to have a plan in place to say, hey, this is an option. And then it's up to them to accept that, or they may even look at it with fresh eyes, see that, and be like, hey, I can tweak that and make it better here. So we can't be so married to our ideas that only our ideas are the best. But if you see something and you present it to your leader, make sure that it's not just a complaint, but there's a way to try and fix it or make it better. And for those of you who feel like you're in a season of waiting, we'd like to leave you all with this thought. The Apostle Paul, he started off his letter to the Galatians by writing this passage, and if you wouldn't mind reading that.
Yeah, absolutely. But when God, who had set me apart, even from my mother's womb, and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles. I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away to Arabia and returned once more to Damascus. Then 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem.
So did you catch that? Paul, the greatest evangelist this world has ever seen, he waited 3 years after he was converted to begin his world-changing ministry. 3 years in Arabia, 3 years in the wilderness. He was waiting for 3 years. This was a man who was fully qualified, yet God made him wait. Actually, if you look at it, his argument would be that he was more qualified than any of the other disciples, even though I guess they had that time with Jesus, but he would have felt like he was the most qualified. And even though he was qualified, God made him wait. And he's not the only one in the Bible who was waited after they were called. If you remember Joseph, we talked about him a little bit earlier, he was given a dream, and then he waited 23 years for that dream to come to pass. Moses, he waited 40 years to fulfill his calling. David was anointed king, and he had to wait 15 years before he was actually the king. Jesus himself, he waited 18 years after he astounded the priests at the temple when he was just 12 years of age. All of these incredible people, they had seasons of waiting, allowing God to develop them into the vessel that he wanted them to be. And you may feel called to something different than where you are currently serving. But while you develop, you can do so much for God right now. And that's really what we want to touch on here today. Don't allow a season of waiting to frustrate you. Don't forget your calling. Don't forget your purpose. Even though you may not necessarily be in charge, you are still growing. You are still developing. You are becoming the person that God wants you to be. The Apostle Paul, he encouraged the church at Ephesus. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1, he said, I implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called. You may not be where God ultimately wants you, but walk worthy of your calling now. Walk worthy of the calling that God has for you right now. You know, the men and women of God that we admire, the people that we have been so blessed to have on this podcast, they didn't just arrive. Like, they didn't just show up one day and now they're these incredible leaders, these wonderful pastors. They had to develop. They had their seasons of waiting. They made the decision every day. They were disciplined, and that propelled them forward toward their calling, propelled them forward toward their purpose. And I just want to finish by sharing this quote from John Maxwell with you all. He said this. He said, "We over-exaggerate yesterday, we overestimate tomorrow, but we underestimate today." And we spend so much time focused on the events of yesterday and the possibilities of tomorrow. You know, what happened in the past, we dwell on that, and then we think about and we dream about the future. And we can sometimes do that at the detriment of today. We miss out on what can be accomplished today through our disciplines, through the decisions that we are making. We're waiting to be in charge, but we have the opportunity to lead now wherever God has placed us. Your God-given purpose and your calling will not come to pass unless you start working today. That's the only way it's going to happen. So I challenge you, wherever you're at right now, even though you may not be in charge, make sure that you are doing your best to be an influence, to be a godly influence, to buy into the vision, and to be that person who is leading those who are around you, even though you may not be in charge.